Hi everyone, my name is Tammy Martin from the Gurnee Police Department, and I wish that we could be in person to read a book to you. Unfortunately, we can't right now, but we will soon. A little background about myself is I have been a police officer with the Village of Gurnee for 24 years. I retired and accepted a new civilian position as public education specialist. So I'm still here in another capacity. I am here to talk a little bit about how reading really helps me in my job. Honestly, I really can't think of any job where you would not need to read, whether it's instructions or, books or things for your job. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, to do your job without learning to read. So that's what we need to do. I am going to read to you a book called George the Gentle Giant. This was a story that I had when I was a kid, so hopefully none of you have heard it before. High on a hill, in a great giant-sized castle, there lived a giant named George. Don't turn around and look at a George if it's in your classroom, because we're not talking about that George, okay? The top of his castle was so high that it touched the clouds. That's crazy. And the bottom of his castle was so low that it touched the ground. George had almost everything that a giant could wish. He had giant-sized chairs, he had giant-sized stairs, had giant-sized doors, and a giant-sized floor. He had cookies as big as a wagon wheel. That is really large. Hard to see here, but that is really big. I kind of would like to have a cookie that size sometimes. And ice cream came as big as haystacks. If you can see this, a big haystack, lots of ice cream. But George was lonely. He had no friends at all, being up there in that castle. He had no giant friends because he was the only giant and in the land, basically. He had no friends at all because everybody in the village was afraid of him. And everybody said to their children, stay away from that castle. You could never tell what that giant might do. Day after day, George went up and down his giant-sized stair. Day after day, George sat on his giant-sized chairs. But he never went outside his castle. So George did not know about the people at all. Then one day, George looked out his castle window and he saw something at the bottom of the hill. He saw the village children playing with puppies and cats and balls and bats, climbing trees and chasing bees. Not a good idea, I think, to chase a bee. Laughing and singing, jumping and swinging. George looked and looked and looked. What are those busy things down there? He said to himself, because he has no friends. They are little and they are noisy and they laugh and they play and they sing. What are they? George watched and watched day after day, day after day, day after day. And so he found out about children. Those busy little things must be children, George said to himself. Some are girls and some are boys, but they are all children. I shall call out to them, he said. And so George called out, yo, ho, ho, in his giant-sized voice. But the children were afraid and they all ran away. Remember, they were told not to go near there at all, but they did. George thought and thought, what do children like? Then he said to himself, picnics. Who doesn't want a picnic? So George planned a big surprise. He sent out invitations to all the children in the village. He made a wonderful lunch with strawberry punch, those cookies as big as wagon wheels, ice cream cones as big as haystacks, and giant-sized hot dogs. He sat and sat, and he waited and waited, but nobody came. Nobody came. Well, said George, he wasn't going to give up. I shall just have to try again. George thought and thought, what do children like? And then he said to himself, songs. Because remember, he heard them laughing and singing. So George made up a song to sing to the children. And it went like this. I'm not going to sing it for you. Trust me. You don't want me to. So I'm going to read it. Yo ho ho, a giant am I. I live in a castle way up high. I'm a friendly giant. Come play with me. I am lonely as I can be. I like puppies and cats and fun and noise and children, especially girls and boys. George put his head out of his window and he sang and he sang and he sang. His voice was so very big. His voice was too big. It rattled things in the village. It rattled chairs and stairs and floors and doors. Can you imagine having that big of a voice? The children were afraid. They all ran away. I do wish the children were my friends, said George, and he wept, a giant-sized tear. The next day it rained and rained. The rain made a big pool at the bottom of the hill. George looked out of his castle window. He looked and looked. Now I know what children like, he said. Children like pools. I like pools. How about you? So George put up a big board with letters on it. It says, Pool for Children, if you can see that. Come and play. George sat and waited and waited. First one child came, and then another, and then another. What a fine giant-sized pool, said all the village children. They stayed and stayed and played and played. Oh, what noise they made. George watched the children from his castle window, and then from his castle door. He's getting closer and closer. George called out to them, Yo, ho, ho. The children looked at George. They saw his friendly smile. They could tell that he was a gentle giant. And they were not afraid, and nobody ran away. Come and play, called one child. Come and play, called all the children. George was very happy. He was not lonely anymore. He now had friends and friends and friends. They played together, they laughed together, they sang together. George made a fine diving board for his diving off. He made a fine slide for sliding down. And he made a great giant-sized horse. And everybody could ride at once. Who do you think the horse was? It's George. He's the one that's the slide and the horse and everything else because he's so big. And now George had everything that a giant could wish. He had giant-sized chairs and giant-sized doors and giant-sized floors. He had cookies as big as a wagon wheel. I wish they'd stop saying that because I really want a cookie now. And ice cream as big as haystacks. And he had all the children in the village for his friends. It's such a great story because I know that a lot of times we feel alone or that we don't have a lot of friends. And sometimes we just have to reach out and, try to be friends with people. And if you can't be friends, don't be enemies. You can still talk to each other. Doesn't mean you have to be best friends, but one of the biggest things that we need is acceptance. And if you're someone that doesn't have a lot of friends, or you see someone who doesn't have a lot of friends, make that effort to make them feel like they belong, because they do. All of us belong here, and we all have a purpose. And that purpose might be just reaching out to somebody that's lonely and that you don't know, and you could develop a great friendship. And at the very least, you could at least make that person feel like someone cares about them. So I've enjoyed reading to you today, and I hope to come soon in person, and I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.